with the hoop set on our chisel, we can move on to lapping the back flat. There's a few reasons why this is a really important process. One is that if the back is not dead flat, then your cutting edge cannot be straight by definition. Having that flat back allows us to really hit a line when we're cutting a mortise or cutting to a line, and it also allows us to get the maximum level of sharpness out of our bevel. In their manufacture, most Japanese chisels don't have a reference to flat. Most of them are finished on some sort of wheel, whether it's leather or steel or stone. And what that means is that it's up to us, the user, to put that flat back in. The ura, the perimeter of the chisel, is the only thing we need to concern ourselves with here. The hollow ground in the middle of the chisel doesn't need to be touched, and that hollow ground has been put there for this very purpose. The main tool for flattening the back of a Japanese chisel is called a kanaban, which is a steel lapping plate. This steel plate is our plate that we get manufactured here in Sydney at an engineering shop, and it's flat to within about 1/2 of a mil across its length. What that means is that we have a known flat surface that we can trust and that does not wear. There's a very good reason why I don't do this process on a waterstone, and that is because a waterstone is designed to dish. As that waterstone dishes, it becomes very hard to control, and it's actually possible to make our back less flat by using a waterstone. So by using a steel plate, we have a surface that we can trust that will bring our other surface into flat with it. To this flat surface, we need to add an abrasive. There are two options here. One is lapping powder. I like to use the fine lapping powder by Shapton for this application. I would only go to a medium or coarse if things are very, very bad. But the fine starts at about 1,000 grit and then fines up quite quickly as it breaks down on the plate. The same can be said for a 1,000 grit waterstone. This is a 1,000 grit Serac stone. I've also done this with Shapton stones, but what I like to do is pass the 1,000 grit stone across the surface and impart a slurry. This is quite simple because a lot of people already have a 1,000 grit waterstone as part of their sharpening setup, so it doesn't require any specialist powders or extra equipment. So what I then have is a known flat surface with a 1,000 grit slurry covering it. I can then take my chisel and I can make some decisions about how I want to lap the back of my chisel flat. One option is to simply lap the first 20 mils. So by passing this front 20 mils along the plate, I can ensure that my cutting edge is lapped flat and I don't concern myself with the rest of the blade. This is a perfectly valid option. I've seen it taught this way. The other option is to pass the whole face of your chisel along the lapping plate. I'm running out of water here, so I'm going to add a little bit more. And by lapping the whole back of the chisel across the lapping plate, what we get is a chisel that can be used to pare a bit further. If we're just looking to knock out mortises and really hit a line crisply at the start of the cut, then we can work with the front 20 mil. If we want a chisel that can pare in from an edge, we want to reference more of the blade, so we want to get all of it on the plate. Personally, I like to do almost all my chisels with the full blade, but it is very much a personal preference. One important thing to remember while lapping out the back of a chisel is that it is very easy to create a step. If I was to simply work the chisel, the front 20 mils of the chisel over and over and over like this, I would eventually create a step down in the back of my chisel. That's not helpful and it's not what we're aiming for. So if I was to do that, I would, as I work, add a little more water. As I work, I would work my way in 5 millimeters and out 5 millimeters, and in 5 millimeters and out 5 millimeters, and that would spread the wear and avoid a very sharp shoulder developing. It is exactly the same process even when I'm doing the whole back, where I will work in 5 millimeters and out 5 millimeters, and in 5 millimeters and out 5 millimeters. During this process, I'm putting almost all of my pressure right at the front over the bevel, because this is the most important part in terms of achieving a nice flat surface. And the very worst thing we can do in this process is lift up the back. If we lift up the back and keep lapping that, we then develop a micro bevel on the back of our chisel, which needs to be sharpened out and is quite a pain to get rid of. So, at the very start of the process, with a brand new chisel, often it's common to take a few passes and discover small grains littering the plate. That can be the lacquer. All chisels are shipped with a lacquer from their manufacturer in Japan, designed to protect against rust while they're in storage waiting to be sold, and that lacquer can get in the way. So sometimes once it's come off, you need to redo your plate and keep going, but here we're looking all right. So starting out in this process, I'm going to take a couple of passes, and it's important to study the working patterns on the steel. We can see that we're getting a lot of steel removal here in this dark area and a bit of steel removal here in this dark area. So where our chisel is effectively bridging the plate slightly, which is not uncommon and actually makes this a little bit simpler. What we're looking to see is where on the back of our chisel we're establishing nice matte patches where the 1000 grit is touching. So here on this chisel I can see that I'm developing a nice matte area about 3 mils behind the front edge. It's very close to touching over here on my right, but is still a good 3 mils away from touching on my left. I need this flat matte area that's being developed by the 1000 grit slurry to encompass the whole of the perimeter of the chisel. So I'm going to keep working. As I work, I like to rotate my plate so that I spread the wear on the plate. And I think a really important point here is to reapply slurry as often as possible to make sure that the slurry on the plate is fresh and aggressive. While applying the slurry, it's quite important to manage the water. Too much water will result in something quite loose and watery. It will just slip off the plate. So I like to just dip the edge of my waterstone, which seems to give me a quite nice consistency on the plate. And with that, I've got a nice matte finish around my whole aura, and I can move on to polishing it to a mirror. To move on to the polishing stage, I'm going to wipe off all of the excess grit that is sitting on my plate. This is going to leave the remnants of my slurry that I can then reactivate by adding small amounts of water. Managing my water here in this phase is very, very important. Working the plate dry will give the best polish, but is not necessarily easy to manage. So with a fingertip of water, it's probably a bit much water for the area, but you can see that I'm beginning to polish up my edge. This process begins to polish the back. It hasn't quite reached the front edge, so I'm going to keep working until that polish gets all the way to the front of the chisel. If I were to now move to another area of the plate, I then need to work grit that has not been broken down yet. This grit that I've already worked has begun to break down, and I can keep working that and breaking it down finer and finer. If I were to move over here, I would start again. However, with the amount that I have to move that polish, I think I'm going to work some coarser, unbroken down grit down the bottom. Finally, before we move on, it's all well and good to be working a nice wide 24mm chisel on a plate, but when you've got something slimmer, like a 3mm or even a 6mm, you kind of need to vary the technique. Doing something aggressive and wide like this can easily result in that chisel rolling around and getting knocked about and not giving you the flat surface you're looking for. So in these circumstances, you can either work it back and forth, like so, or you can also pull down towards you. And I think this gives you more control than pushing, but you will soon discover what works and what doesn't. The end aim is the same. We're looking for a nice matte area all around the front edge and around the ura ideally, which we can then polish with the same procedure as a larger chisel. But with a nice polished back on our chisel, we can then move on to finally sharpening the bevel.